Welcome back to another episode of The Conscious Artist, a safe space for conversations around mental health awareness for musicians, artists, and all human beings. I am your host, Pallavi Mahidara. I'm a concert pianist and teacher, and I am absolutely thrilled that you are joining us today. My hope for this show is that it will give all of us a sense of solidarity and knowledge that we are not alone, and together, through these conversations, we can create more awareness and change for a healthier future. My guest today is an Indian-American composer. She received her bachelor's from the Juilliard School in New York and her master's and doctorate from Yale School of Music. She is the composer in residence at the Los Angeles Master Chorale and the Seattle Symphony, and artistic director of Shastra, a nonprofit organization that promotes cross-cultural music collaboration between the music tradition of India and the West. Her unique style of being able to bridge the compositional gap between Indian and Western classical music is making her one of the most sought-after composers of today's generation. I could go on about her many achievements, but first, please join me in welcoming our guest today, Reena Esmail. Reena, welcome to The Conscious Artist.
It's so wonderful to be here, Pallavi. So nice to see you and talk to you.
Thank you for joining us. I'm really thrilled to have you here. You and I first met years and years ago when I was visiting a mutual friend and colleague at Yale, and I remember being so proud to know of another Indian American studying Western classical music. You know, I think when we were growing up, there were so few of us in this space, and I love how much that is changing with the younger generations. But anyway, I was thinking for our conversation today, if you could start us off with a little bit of your backstory and how you began your ventures into the classical music world.
Absolutely. So it was really interesting because, in America, I'm just considered Indian. Like most of us, people can't quite distinguish between different subcultures within India. But in India, I'm kind of a crazy combination of things. My father is Gujarati and my mom is Goan. And so people from Goa was, of course, colonized by Portugal. And so people there study Western classical music. And so when I kind of expressed interest in music and I kind of was really drawn to it, my mom started putting me in Western classical music lessons. So I started with guitar, played a little bit of violin, and then finally settled on the piano. And I know you've taken piano a lot further than I have, but I was straight up until the end of high school was very, very serious about being a pianist. And then what was interesting was that over the years, I realized that I am not a performer. Like I can be in the music, I can be practicing, but the minute you put me on a stage in front of other people, I just freeze. And so I realized that there were other ways I could be in music. And one of those was to be a composer, to kind of be behind the scenes, to be creating the music. And so ultimately, I moved towards composition.
Wow, I love that so much. And I have to say, the world is a much richer place with your compositions. So thank you for sticking with music. But I'm so curious to know how you began this journey of your mix of Indian and Western classical music, because as we both know, the origins of both date very, very, very far back, and they may have some similarities very far back, but they quickly go into very different paths and very different ways of compositional style.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, I was primarily trained as a Western classical musician up until much more recently. And that was really all that I knew. But if I have to really pinpoint what made me start to be interested in Indian classical music, it's because, as you said, at that time in the early 2000s, I was in conservatory and people just didn't see very many South Asians there. And so, of course, people are trying to make conversation and they're looking at me and they're saying, "Oh, you're Indian. Do you do stuff with Indian music?" And of course, I would feel so embarrassed that I knew nothing of my own culture. And at the same time felt like, oh, I'm just trying so hard to just be good at this one thing, which is just composing music for orchestras and chamber groups. And, that's hard enough as it is,
I relate so much to that.
And, you just think, oh, I just don't know this other tradition. And at the same time, I knew just enough about Indian classical music to feel that it was such a deep, rich tradition that there were clearly, my counterparts in India who had been studying this tradition since the time they were very young. And I didn't want to bastardize a tradition that I didn't know a lot about. And so it took me I would say about 10 years from the time that people started asking me that question until I finally really found my way in Indian classical music. And what those 10 years looked like was me actually starting to meet kind of offline while I was at conservatory studying Western classical music. I would start to meet these people who were Indian women who were musicians, but clearly they weren't Western classical musicians. They were Hindustani or Carnatic musicians. And so it was through my wanting to bond with them, musician to musician, that I just kind of learned the bare bones scaffolding of Indian classical music. And it finally it's so funny because it was at Yale where I really began to study Indian classical music. And it was because
Wow.
it's like, yeah, can you believe it? I also studied Hindi at Yale for the first time, which I just don't know how to parse that. I feel like it's the same thing of when I go to Cost Plus and I just hate myself for shopping at World Market for a culture that I'm actually from. But so I was at Yale and they had hired a visiting professor from Delhi to teach us Hindustani classical vocal music. And the thing that was so fascinating to me was that this teacher didn't know anything about Western classical music. So she wasn't trying to make a connection between the music I already knew. She was just like, I'm an Indian teaching Indian classical music. This is what it is. And somehow not having to go through that Western lens, just being like, person to person, Indian to Indian, learning this art form, it did something to me. And I thought, ooh, this is a direct path to something that I don't have to go through a different culture to get to. And it was really incredible. And that was the beginning of something. And that was, about 12, 13 years ago now.
Wow. What a fascinating story. And I have to say, I relate so much to what you said before. Like people used to say that all the time. Oh, you're Indian. Oh, do you play Indian classical music?
Right.
And I would also feel super embarrassed. And my constant answer was, it doesn't really work well on the piano.
Which is, you're not wrong. It's stressful.
I mean, we don't have quarter tones,
Right.
like that's like the biggest thing, one of the biggest things in Indian classical music. And that's why, of course, with violin, it can work so well, or with singing, of course, it can work so well. And I have to say, that's what I love about your compositions, because you have found such a successful way to bring the style of Indian classical music and even techniques of Indian classical music into Western instrumentation with Western instruments. So I'm blown away by that.
Thank you.
But yeah, this whole thing of it was so funny when you were saying earlier that in America you're Indian and in India you're something else.
Right.
And I have struggled with that like cross-cultural identity confusion my whole life. We grew up in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
Like 80s, 90s. And yeah, I was always the brown kid and I was always very Indian in America. Like I wasn't like the white kids. But then in India, I was obviously American.
Exactly.
Because of my American accent. And, my parents always said, okay, don't speak when we go into this shop. Otherwise they'll jack up the price.
Exactly. I have to say the funny thing about that is that when I lived in India, so I did a Fulbright in India, and by the time I got to the end of that Fulbright, I was so good at appearing like I was an Indian from India that my parents came to visit me, and I did the same thing to them. I had to send them away so that they wouldn't seem too American. So it goes full circle.
That is amazing. That is really amazing. And I have to say, I also studied Hindi for 1 year at Penn while I was at Curtis, and Curtis had an exchange with Penn.
Wow.
So the first time I actually studied Hindi was in college.
I totally relate to that. And there's a part of you that just hates yourself for that. And there's a part of you that's like, well, I'm a multicultural person. I'm going to take it where I can get it.
I relate very much. But it's interesting because this actually ties very much into something that I want to speak to you about today. I remember I saw on your Instagram that you made a post some years ago called Letter to the Young Artist Immigrant Parents. Could you tell our listeners what that letter was about and what inspired you to write it?
Yes. So of course, in my career, I travel a lot. I see a lot of different people. And of course, because I'm South Asian, sometimes other South Asians, whether they're adults or kids, anyone who's interested in classical music will often gravitate towards me. And I've started to connect to many young South Asians. And what I realize is, we talk a lot about representation of different races and genders and various minority groups within Western classical music. And I think sometimes we think that the only reason that people are not being represented in our musical system is due to racism or due to some kind of discrimination. And I think as South Asians, we have a slightly different situation, because I was starting to see that the main reason that South Asians were leaving Western classical music was not because they were not talented, not because they weren't being given opportunities, but because at a certain point, their parents or their family or their community would sit them down and say, hey, look, we're glad that you're good at this, but you need to have a more lucrative career. You need to do something that's going to be more stable and is going to make more money. And that's a really common thing. And even for many of us who are South Asian of our age and older who work in classical music, many people have second degrees in biomed or in
Yes. Oh my
finance or
goodness.
something
Yeah.
like that. It's very common. And so I was thinking, what can I do about this? Because I don't want these kids to get separated from their families because they are trying to have a career in the arts. I don't want them that, you need all the help you can get. You shouldn't estrange your own parents unless it's absolutely necessary, right? And
Right.
so
Right.
as I was thinking about it, I realized that in a strange way, the way that our parents were as immigrants in this country connects so deeply to the way that we are as artists, because they came to this country with probably not a lot, but with good bones, with good educations, and they were kind of ready to work and ready to fight the hard fight. And a lot of them struggled a lot. Many of our parents came in the 60s and 70s, and they started with pretty much nothing and built it up into something that's incredible. And that is so impossible in so many ways. And there's so many skills that we watched them form as we were growing up. We watched them really have perseverance. We watched them just, go through the odds and figure out how to make things work. We watched them be so creative in their ways of finding ways to make income, finding ways to learn a language, all these different things. And so, of course, as the children of those parents, we are thinking, we don't necessarily want to be comfortable. We want to do what they did. We wanted to do this really impossible but deeply fulfilling thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that our parents have the skills to help us in many ways they might not realize, because they might not be able to understand everything about the mechanics of major and minor keys or something, but they can certainly help us understand how to put ourselves in the right situations, how to maximize the knowledge we have to create the world that we want to see and to create the career that we want to have. So I think there's a way that those skill sets are deeply aligned, and I want parents and their children to see that.
I think that's so important and so valuable, and I completely agree with everything in the letter and everything you've said now. I think I was lucky. My parents were very supportive from pretty much the beginning. I mean, in the very beginning, maybe when I was 6 or 7, they used to say, okay, you can play piano if you get straight A's.
Right.
But, I think they quickly realized that I was very serious and that I was very dedicated and self-disciplined as well.
Right.
But like you say, a lot of the skills that we have seen them apply to their own lives, they're the same.
Right.
Discipline, grit, perseverance, hard work. How is that any different in our field from what they did, you know?
Exactly. And I mean, even I agree with you. My parents also were quite supportive of me because they're pretty unusual as far as Indian parents go. Like I said, they're from two different parts of India. And my dad is a Muslim, my mom is a Catholic. And the fact that they're even married to each other is amazing.
It's beautiful.
And so I remember when my dad was telling me he had moved from Pakistan to do a second master's degree. And when his mother had kind of set up these brides for him when he came back to visit, and they were going to try to get him an arranged marriage. And he was basically like, okay, I met this Catholic girl in Orlando. We're getting married. Sorry. And every time I do something that my parents are like, well, should you really be doing that? Play it safe. I'm like, well, this is my history. So just letting you know that the apple has barely fallen far enough from the tree. I'm very close to the kind of creative thinkers that they were and still are.
I love that. I love that. It's fun now as adults to remind our parents of all the risky things they did, you know. We're like, "Well,
Exactly.
you taught us how to take risks and get up even when we fall." So,
And I think that's the point, is that that's what you have to learn as an artist, because there's no artist, I mean, even the greatest professional artists, who haven't had major failures. And at a certain point, it's not about how few failures you have. It's about how willing you are to brush yourself off, really dive in and learn what you can, but then to ultimately move on and really be true to your own vision of what you want to create in the world.
I love that, and I say that all the time. It's not the hardships that we face, but it's how we face them that shows our character and really shows who we are and shows what we're capable of. And I wonder if maybe, you know, I can't say the number of times I used to hear the phrase music is a hobby. And again, not from my parents. My parents were very supportive, but from the Indian community in general, you know,
Yeah.
or seeing my colleagues or friends that maybe were very talented singers or painters, but, you know, their parents said, no, you need to go to a real school and get a real job. Oh, are you still, and like I would always hear these questions from random people in India, you know, maybe friends of friends of friends or friends of family or something, but oh, are you still doing music? But what are you actually studying? Oh, you get paid to perform?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, because it's hard for them to it's hard for them to wrap their head around something that's so foreign to them.
Exactly. And I mean, when there's just a point. I remember the first time I went to India. So I was not one of those kids who went to India every year. The first time I went was when I was done with my undergrad. So I must have been about 22 years old. And
Wow.
it was so interesting because I just had never seen the culture as a full culture. I'd always seen it as a little subculture within, where I grew up in California. And so it was amazing because all of a sudden I could see my life through the eyes of people who lived in India. And I remember I visited some relatives, and a very similar thing happened where they said, like, okay, so you do music, but what do you actually do? And I said, oh no, that's what I actually do. And they were like, okay, but you did an undergraduate degree, right? What was that in? And I was like, well, music. And so yeah, I'm just imagining what they're seeing, and they're seeing maybe some street performer or something who's just playing music on a corner, and they're
Right.
thinking this
Right.
person has they've studied this for 4 years, like, really? And when I'm seeing it through their eyes, I can see how absolutely preposterous it sounds, but it's just because they don't have the context. But what I think is amazing about that is that because we came from an environment where music was not a given. It was so amazing when I first began to meet people who came from families where all the kids were in the arts, or one was a chef and one was a painter, and I was like, wait, there are families that just believe that the arts are just important for their own sake. I had never experienced that. But the thing for me was that it actually made me able to sometimes defend what I do in situations where people don't have those assumptions. And it made me really have to understand why what I do is important, or why it should be a full-time career if you want it to be. And I think like that has really, and on the other hand, I'll say it's also helped me really understand people who don't believe it should be. It's helped me find compassion for
Mm.
them as well, and compassion for viewpoints that I don't share. And I think as a composer, you're going into so many situations, you're working with so many people who have, various political beliefs, various religious beliefs, different assumptions about things. And you want to find a way to uniquely connect with each one of them, even if you don't share their beliefs. You want to be able to at least understand where they're coming from. And so that different perspective on my career, I think, really set me up for that.
I love that. That's very poignant. And, you know, I wonder if maybe our parents or our aunts and our uncles or the family friends, you know, a lot of their preconceived notions about the arts are also fear based. right? It's not easy to be an artist in any culture.
Exactly.
Doesn't matter where you come from.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to dissuade them of that fear at all, because I don't want them to somehow think that just because I happen to make it as a full-time musician, there's a way that anyone can. I mean, it's very, very difficult, as you, of course, know.
Sure.
And so, I mean, I think all we can do, we can't be certain about anything, but one thing I've been thinking about is, what is the pathway? I mean, it's very easy to offer someone encouragement and say, keep at it, you're great. And it's another thing to actually think, okay, what does it take to get someone who's very talented and young and is looking to make a career in music? What can I do to actually really support them over the long term? And I think, I'm finally at the age where I've had people who I just mentor kind of informally, who I've been mentoring for, 10, sometimes almost 15, 20 years. And I've just kind of watched their career grow. And if they need me, they know where to find me. And it's been really interesting to just see how sometimes a little bit of encouragement, or a little bit of maybe just connecting one person to another person, or maybe even just having them kind of spill their thoughts out and me trying to help them make sense of that thing. Maybe that's really the thing that will make the difference. And so I think it takes so much more than just a few encouraging words to help create a long, sustainable career as a musician. But I do think we have some power in that regard as professional musicians. And that's why I'm so glad that there are more South Asians in the field who can understand the perspective that someone is coming from and help them work through what they need to be the best artist they can be.
Absolutely. It's funny. I think maybe I would say probably 15 years ago, probably both you and I could have counted the number of South Asians we knew in classical music that were like in the circuit,
Absolutely.
like on one, maximum two hands.
Right.
And this ties back to something you mentioned in the beginning, which is representation does matter. And I know this episode isn't specifically about that, but I think it's also so great that not only as musicians and artists who are making our way and being able to make it as a full-time career, we're able to provide that mentorship and that experience to the younger generations, but I think also as South Asian Indian musicians that are studying Western classical music, we are, I mean, I hate using this word, but we are a little bit niche.
Yes, absolutely.
But I'm curious to know, did you ever face discrimination as an Indian in Western classical music? Did you ever have people doubting your classical music abilities because of your skin color and where you come from?
I'm so glad you asked that, because it was just a really interesting exercise in perception of how my mind started to perceive discrimination or the lack thereof. I would say that I never thought of myself as being discriminated against in any way for most of my childhood, because again, Indians have this reputation of, throwing the SAT curve or doing whatever. So no one ever doubted my intelligence or my ability to work hard. And I had that going for me stereotypically. But what was really interesting is when I went to India to actually study Indian classical music. So I went when I was 26 and I spent a whole year there. And it was fascinating because my teachers there, I think, again, maybe stereotypically, they were looking at me and they were thinking, this is a person who looks like she should understand how this thing works. And so when I didn't understand something, their attitude was kind of like, well, I mean, you're going to get it eventually. I mean, you look like you should understand this, essentially. And so they believed in me in a way that I think parallels, when I would go into the market and I would just be speaking in kind of half broken Hindi until I really started to pick it up. People would just assume that I was someone who was living there, who knew how to speak the language, who knew what was going on. And when people start to talk to you like you understand what's going on, you are it takes much less time for you to actually understand what's going on, because it's like you're meeting their expectation. And there's so many, studies on this that I can't even think of right now. But the idea that when we set an expectation of how we expect someone to be, they do meet it more than if we set a different, lower expectation for them. And so, I mean, I found this really fascinating when I was in India. And then when I came back to the US, that is when I saw how different it was in the US. So, I'd been through most of my career, I'd been through a
Mm.
master's degree in music. And then I suddenly saw in people's eyes, I would be teaching theory to undergrads at Yale. And there were times when I would be talking about, modulations in Wagner or, sonata allegro form and the various, Schubert has this extra theme in there. And, it was talking about these things that I
Mhm.
had actually a much deeper knowledge of than I did of Indian classical music. And I saw people kind of be like, does she really know? And you sometimes just see
Mm.
something in people's eyes that I didn't see in India. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. And one of the things that I think I noticed more than anything was that the stereotype holds true is that people think that South Asians are smart, but they don't necessarily think that South Asians are creative. And so,
Mm.
they will hire people to teach theory and to talk about kind of the hard subjects. But the minute you want to be creative, the minute you want to do something that's kind of off the beaten path, people are saying, no, 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 no. You're the one who we need in the back office, like taking care of everything and making sure it's running right. We don't want you to be the visionary,
Mm.
right? And I think, number one, that's why I really want to encourage whoever feels that they want to have a career in the arts to go into the arts, because we just need more examples of that. And on the other hand, I think there were many people in our generation who could have gone into the arts and maybe went into tech or medicine instead, and they bring that creativity to those fields. And I've seen, especially in recent years now that people of our generation are working and are, getting to middle age, the amount of creativity in the South Asian community in all fields.
Wow, your experience is very interesting. I think I've had the opposite experience in the
Ooh,
sense that I don't, I mean, as far as I know, I have not experienced any overt discrimination in the Western world, whether it was in the States or in Europe, being brown,
right,
doing
right.
Western classical music. But oddly enough, I experienced that in India.
Interesting.
I remember I was performing once in Pune, and my parents were attending the concert because they were in the country at the time with me, and there was a lady sitting behind my parents, and obviously she didn't know that they were my parents, and they were this lady and her mother were looking at a program and saying, "Oh, who is this Pallavi? I've never heard of her. Well, if it's not good, we'll leave at intermission." And my dad like almost turned around but didn't. And then of course they were still there after intermission. They stayed till the end of the concert and they were super enthusiastic. And but the bias is that if you're in Indian playing Western classical music in India, then you must not be very good, because Western classical music is for Western people. So when the Western people come to India to play, then of course they're amazing. Or the East Asians come to play, then of course they're amazing.
Right.
But the doubt was, can a brown kid play? And that was very, very strange for me. But it's actually been kind of a running theme growing up, because whenever I was playing in different countries and I would be interested in getting, for example, like the Indian embassy involved or something like this, just whether it was some support or maybe doing a collaboration, like doing a concert there or something, because I also wanted to bring more awareness of Western classical music to India.
Right.
And I would always hear back from the Indian embassies that, oh, but you're not an Indian, like you weren't born in India, you're not playing Indian classical music. Why don't you go talk to the American embassy? And the American embassy would say, but you're Indian, why don't you talk to the Indian embassy? And it was always this like runaround
Yeah.
that I didn't know where I fit in, and I didn't know who was actually interested in giving any sort of support in the development of my career. It was very strange.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you're saying this, because I actually think, in a strange way, our experiences do complement each other. Because when I was in India, I was going there as someone who was a student of Indian classical music. And so I wasn't going as a Western musician, in all honesty. And
Mm.
I saw in my teacher's eyes that they were like, we don't know what music you were doing before, but we're just so glad that you found your own cultural music.
Mm.
So I think if I had gone in as a Western classical musician, I might have had a very similar experience to you. because of course they don't have a framework for understanding what Western classical music is. And imagine going in as a composer where you're going into an improvised tradition. So they're like, we don't even know how to understand what you're doing, which
Right.
is that, I mean, we sit down and that same person is composing on the spot. And
Right.
so what's your deal?
Right. Why can't you do that? Why do you need notes?
Exactly, exactly. And I joke because I work with so many Indian classical musicians now that sometimes when they're trying to enlist a composer, they'll say something like, "Oh, I'm going to sing and you just like throw some stuff under there and that'll be great." And I am like, "No, no, no, no. This is a major effort that needs to be taken here. It's not that I just, put some beats under it and we're done. There's a lot that goes into this." But I think because they
Right.
don't have the context to understand what that is, of course, they're just trying to relate it to something they know, which might be really minimal.
Absolutely. Yeah. The only experience I had playing some music by an Indian composer was many, many years ago. I got to meet and work with Vanraj Bhatia, who was a very famous, particularly film score composer. He did a lot of Sham Benegal's films
Wow.
in India, and he studied Western classical music with Nadia Boulanger and Howard Ferguson, and he had written many works with Western notation. And I actually got to give the world premiere of one of his very large scale solo piano works called Fantasy and Fugue in C. And it was ambiguous C because the fantasy was based on the Mahabharata, the Indian epic for
Yeah.
our listeners that might not know. And the fugue was based on an Indian raga. And it was super cool for me to, like, for the first time, be able to give an answer to the question, "Oh, do you play Indian music?"
Right. You're like, well, it's so funny that you bring that up because I feel like in so many ways in this next generation, because as you know, I write music that is many times in rag or, around rag and really deals with the concepts of Hindustani classical music and is often written for Western musicians. And this next generation of students who's starting to become really adept at their instruments and starting to think about being professional musicians, I find that when people ask them if they do things from their own culture, a lot of them say, "Oh yes, I play this piece by Reena Esmail." And it's kind of amazing because I mean, I didn't have that. And it's like going through life not being able to really access that cultural space from your own training. I think I took that really seriously. And I mean, the amount of times I can't tell you where a professional musician has come to me, someone who's a teacher at a university and will say, "I didn't know your music, but I have this one South Asian student who played your piece for the audition to our school. And that's how I got to know who you are." And so
Wow.
in a way, it's now going both ways where I feel like young people who are going into the field are actually introducing and taking my music much further forward than I ever could.
Wow, I love that. I love that so much. And I think you are such a great force of nature with your ability to bring these two worlds together. I really, really love your musical style and your compositional style. Like, of all of the things that I've heard of your works, I just find it such a beautiful collaboration of who we are. And I feel represented. I feel every aspect of myself represented. And I think that's so powerful to people that, I mean, come on, even in today's world now, so many South Asians are in Hollywood on Netflix and in huge TV shows, and we're like, "Oh my gosh, there's a brown girl on a
Right.
show as a main character." And everyone's watching.
Yeah, and in my mind, I'm thinking, wait, what are people seeing who are not South Asian? Because I'm seeing myself when I watch Never Have I Ever.
Right? Oh my gosh, I related so much to that.
Right. I that's one show that the minute I started, I just know I'm going to binge the whole thing. I have to just set aside a day to, be with that show. Um,
Exactly.
but it's amazing to have other people who are not South Asian be able to see into what that experience is, even though the main character Devi is like a million times cooler than I ever was when I was that age. But it's really fascinating to just be able to see and to be able to actually share and talk to other people about an experience because everyone has seen that show. And for us, it's like, well, what can we do? We're also artists. We also operate in the sphere. What can we do to create access points to our culture, either for South Asians who really do want to connect to their own culture, or for people who are not South Asian who deeply want to explore this culture, because it's like we come from one of the richest musical cultures. It would be crazy to not share that with the world.
Absolutely. And I think that's also possibly why Western classical music was never that popular in India, because we have such a rich tradition of Indian classical music, as you said, both Hindustani and Carnatic. Like, we have such a rich tradition. We don't need anything else.
Right. Yeah, it was so interesting when I was applying for the Fulbright. They were saying that often the country that you're applying to gets to decide who the final Fulbrighters are, because they pick the things that they need. And so with India, I mean, the people who were getting picked were people who were doing medical research, who were doing, sanitation research, doing the things related to infrastructure, because those are all things that India really does need. And I remember them saying, well, what are you giving to India musically? Like, what do you really have to offer them? And I really felt like
Right.
I was so lucky to be accepted for a Fulbright in music, because I was just learning so much more from the culture than I could even figure out how to give back at that time. But I almost feel like the decade afterwards has been about figuring out what I can give back to India and how I can bring these cultures a little closer together.
Well, you're doing it. You're literally bringing Indian classical music into the Western realm where people are actually able to fuse the two. And I think that's so, so incredible. It's so funny. I feel like classical music takes so much discipline, so much dedication, so much hard work, resilience. And that like really feeds into the stereotype of Indian culture. You think it would be perfect, like a perfect field for Indians.
Yeah, I always marvel at how East Asians have really embraced the values of classical music in a way where, I mean, there's no orchestra you go to see, there's no competition where there's not some East Asian people, and actually a lot of them, and they're doing so well and they're dominating. And I'm always thinking, why it feels weird that as South Asians we have so many of the same values, but we've just never really taken that to heart. But I don't know, I think maybe it is just in this generation we're going to start finding many more people who are set up well to be able to play piano competitions with their kids.
I hope so, because I think I mentioned this in another episode in season 2, but I'm pretty sure that I was the first fully female Indian to attend Curtis. And I know that I was to attend Reina Sofia in Madrid and Hans Eisler in Berlin. I,
Yeah.
I know that I was first in a lot of these things. And it's so strange for me to think about that now, when we speak about, for example, Kamala Harris being the first Indian and Black, half Indian, half Black woman to be in office as a vice president. Like, how
Right.
incredible is that? But again, like what we've been talking about, I just feel like it's also because we didn't see people making that a reality in our culture before. I don't know, but I feel like you and I can take like 1% credit for, helping to pave the way for the younger generations. We're like, okay, we fought with our parents and our culture for you, so you can go play music.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I definitely feel that way. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I have so many Indian parents who do come to me when they have kids who want to go to conservatory and who are, they really want to pursue music and they're not sure. And what I'm so glad about is that these parents will seek me out and be like, look, I really want to support my kid, but I want to make sure that I'm not just doing the wrong thing. Like, I have no way of knowing if my kid has what it takes. I just don't know. And I'm like, well, I'm so glad you came to me, because I can actually make some kind of evaluation. I can give you some recommendations. I can put you in touch with the right people. I'm happy to do that. And so I think it is sometimes just about people seeing us doing something. And then sometimes it's about us actually getting in there and really helping people in whatever way we possibly can. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit of everything.
I love that. Well, as I said, the world is a much richer place with your compositions. And I hope that all of you listening out there will go check out Reena's music. It's such a beautiful canvas of both of our cultures, being raised in the West and having very deep Indian roots. So, Reena, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a great conversation.
Oh, it was so lovely to talk to you, and may the conversation continue.
Thank you all so much for listening. I am truly grateful for the support from each and every one of you. If you would like to submit any questions or topics for us to address on the show, you can send us a message on our Instagram page at Conscious Artist Podcast. Help us to spread more awareness by sharing this episode with your friends, your colleagues, your teachers, and your students. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sending you all so much love and strength to tackle this week, and we'll see you next Monday for another episode of The Conscious Artist.